Ready to get this conversation started. My name is Crystal Willis. I'm here representing Women in Film International. And Women in Film International is an LA-based organization, and we are sponsoring 12 films in the Awareness Film Festival, including the ones represented here today. So we'll be speaking to some filmmakers. And today's panel is titled Trauma and Transformation. So these filmmakers have explored various concepts as they relate to trauma or healing or transformation. So just to introduce myself to you all a little bit more, again, my name is Crystal Willis. I am a rape survivor and birth mother from rape. I placed my child in an open adoption at the age of 14. And I've worked in the entertainment industry for over 10 years, marketing and PR, mostly for various film, TV, and music labels. Studios. So I'm really passionate about entertainment and now really tapping into facilitating change in the world. Power, love, and freedom through entertainment, music, film, television. So I'm really excited and honored to be a part of this discussion today. And I hope you all will bear with me. This is actually my first time moderating a panel. So thank you so much for being here and being a part of this experience for me. I appreciate that. So first I want to introduce our panelists. So we have Trisha Costales, who is the filmmaker with The Bridge, Pathways to a Trauma-Informed Community. She's also the CEO of the Guidance Center, which I understand works with 3,000 children who've struggled with mental health, correct?
We are a nonprofit children's mental health agency. We're headquartered in Long Beach, but have reach throughout the county. We treat very, very troubled, very low-income families. We treat about 3,500 a year this past year, children and their families. I'm a therapist by trade and by experience, although I don't see clients anymore. I am the CEO of the organization.
Fantastic. All right, and we have Ananda Moore, who is a filmmaker who brought us Magic Pills, Homeopathy, Promise or Placebo. So introduce yourself to us, Ananda, and what inspired you to make the film.
So I am a homeopath, and I have a small shop in Toronto that kind of acts as a hub for homeopathy in Canada. We sell books and remedies and all kinds of stuff. But I think there's two inspirations for the film. One is my original inspiration was learning about what happened in the film. We look at how Cuba used homeopathy to stop a large-scale epidemic. And when I learned about this, I knew that the mainstream media would never talk about it. I knew that this kind of information is consistently suppressed, and I needed to think about how I can present more of these stories to the public. At the same time, I was having my own doubts as a practitioner. Homeopathy is a very difficult thing to practice. And if it was just placebo and not really effective, and I wasn't really helping people, I wanted to know if I was doing the right thing in the world. And my last motivation, I guess, was in the way it's presented in the film, as well as how the media attacked me personally, attacked my colleagues, set them up and people lost their jobs. And it was very much misinformation and lies that were published and that were presented on television. And I wanted a medium to show the other perspective of what homeopathy is and how it's actually working and the science behind it.
Thank you, Ananda. So next we have Rachel Merrick, who is responsible for the film What Doesn't Kill Me? And tell us a little bit more about that and introduce yourself to us.
Hello everybody. I made the film What Doesn't Kill Me, Domestic Violence and the Battle for Custody. My distributors have given it a second title, which is fine. And I made it as a reaction to, I was making a short film about a survivor in Oklahoma, a little old lady who survived 62 years of a violent marriage. And I was going to make a short film about her, but it sort of snowballed and it all opened up, and I saw something so offensive that I thought I cannot stop until I've done everything within my power to try and my power is making a film. I mean, I am an editor, so I wasn't actually a film director at the time, but that's what I am now. And I was just so disturbed, I thought, I have to do something. And I kept following this subject of why abusive parents can obtain custody easier than a protective parent. And I thought, well, this doesn't make any sense to me. And so I kept going and going until I haven't really found an answer. I found a bunch of answers, and it's still is a bit shocking. But that was my reason for making the film. And I made it for no money over 6 years. And so I had to keep stopping so that I could earn money to survive, and pay the, rent and all that kind of stuff. So it was a labour of love, and, in itself, a sort of transformation and a reaction to a sort of seeing something traumatic happen.
I imagine you all share this labor of love here.
Yeah.
So these films are screening, just to give you all a heads up, these films are screening today. Magic Pills will show today at 2 o'clock, as well as The Bridge, Pathways to Trauma-Informed Community. And at 4 o'clock, What Doesn't Kill Me will be showing. So let's jump right in and have some discussion, and then towards the end, we'll open it up for you all to ask a couple of questions, all right? So let's start with you, Rachel. So one of the things that I learned about What Doesn't Kill Me, domestic violence and the battle for custody, is that this is an atrocity. I was actually pretty blown away to hear it, but I learned that an abusive father wins custody 70% of the time when a mother or the other parent accuses them. And so talk to us about parental alienation and how you discovered this issue was bigger than.
Well, on the whole, this only happens when the father or the abusive parent comes after custody. In normal situation, a normal divorce, if there's no power control issues, custody is shared or whatever, there's a normal fight for custody. But in this situation, where the abuser has the money, the power, the control, and wants to continue that power and control, but the other parent escapes with the children to protect them. The only way of carrying on the abuse is to try and gain custody. So it's a way of continuing abuse.
So a way to regain control over the victim.
Yes, and even if they don't necessarily want the children, it's still a way of continuing that kind of abuse. And the people involved in, it's such a ridiculous, unbelievable situation that a lot of the women that have been involved in this just, they're shell-shocked and amazed and think that it's completely and utterly unique, and that they're in this mad situation until the kind of whole thing's over and they put their head up over the water and they see, when they go searching, they can see that there's hundreds and hundreds of people all over the country who've exactly the same things happen to them. And I forgot the original question.
Okay. That's all right. I mean, what's your take on this? To me, it almost sounds like a re-traumatization of a
Yes.
woman or the victimized parent.
Deeply, deeply unfair. You have a woman who's been through hell. She's trying to do the best for her children, and yet she's then taken into court, re-victimized, and then often charged with failure to protect her own children. If she stays too long, she's charged with failure to protect. If she decides to go, she's very much at risk at losing the children. It's just an impossible situation, an absolutely impossible situation. And once she gets to court, she doesn't have the resources. The abuser or the father, it's not always fathers, sometimes it's the other way around, sometimes the same-sex relationships this happens in. But I've decided to take on mothers and children because I'm a mother with a child. And she is re-victimized through the courts because she cannot pay for a lawyer. He probably has plenty of money to pay for experts to sort of, testify how crazy she is. She probably feels crazy, she probably looks crazy, as you would. And yes, so she ends up losing her children.
Well, we're going to talk more about that because I want to learn too more about what you've observed with the unfairness of the judicial system, as
Yeah.
well as some of those personal experiences that come out in the film. But going back to kind of how children are affected, I wanted to talk to Tricia about this. I would love to hear more from you about, because one of the things that I've had the opportunity to do is some speaking to women who've come off of Skid Row and potentially escaped an abusive situation and now in a transitional facility, getting back on their feet. So explain to us, what is a trauma-informed approach, and how does that affect your work in poverty and dealing with children?
That's the whole sort of thesis or premise of the Bridge. As a mental health provider, we see horrifically traumatized children coming to our agency every day, 3,500 a year. And, they may come with a series of different problems. They're coming because the school made them come, because they're getting in trouble at school, or they got in trouble with the law, or they won't listen at home, their behavioral problems, or they're feeling suicidal. What we realize as we get to know them is underlying all of their diagnoses or presentations is trauma. And one of my frustrations as the CEO of this mental health agency, we've grown so much and we see so many kids and we just can't keep up with the demand for our services. So I started thinking about how we could get the word out. Like, what if we looked at the community or the neighborhood or the school as our client instead of the family? And that's how this piece came about. And I wouldn't have thought actually to make this film to present about trauma-informed communities, but I happen to know a filmmaker who's a friend of mine, Matt Murray. He's here in the audience, and we were talking about how to really spread the word about being a trauma-informed community, and hatched this plot to make this piece together. But really the premise is that people don't have to be therapists to be therapeutic in how they interact and conduct themselves in the world. And if people recognized that and recognized when they see bad behavior, odd behavior, or someone homeless, that they're seeing someone who's troubled instead of somebody who's bad, your interactions are different with them. So the piece is really about trying to educate people on just that, how to recognize symptoms or behaviors of trauma when you see them, and what we can all do as just sort of human beings in our neighborhoods to help address it. Because especially with children, we see a whole plethora of really troubled behaviors. And if what we need to do as a community, and we do well as a mental health agency, is try to help them feel safe. And then those behaviors do dissipate.
Now I'm interested, as a survivor of child abuse and having experienced my own level of trauma and mental health and nearly touching homelessness myself, I'm curious on the flip side, how does poverty reinforce trauma?
Well, that's a big highlight of the piece as well, because something that I always say is poverty in and of itself is traumatic, especially for a child who's growing up, but for anybody. We focused on children because that's our specialty, children and their parents. But imagine being 8 and you don't have enough to eat, or you're living in a car, or you're walking through neighborhoods where there's homelessness everywhere, and you go home and summer break is scary because you don't get free lunches anymore, and you're a child, and what confidence does that give you in your parent to care for you or to believe that the world is safe and somehow welcoming of you. So poverty, or they get evicted, or they're living in a car. We have so many children who live in cars, and then they're expected to go to school and get good grades and listen. And it has, all the symptoms you see of trauma, PTSD, all the things you think of when you think of trauma. Poverty does all of those things to young children growing up if they don't have other protective circumstances in their life.
Yeah.
For me, that's just a new perspective, a new way of looking at it, because I could imagine how trauma or mental health could cause someone to become, or be put in a situation of poverty, but I never thought how the poverty reinforces the trauma.
And it's perpetuating,
Yeah.
because if the parent's poor, the child grows up in poverty, they don't do well in school because they have so many behavioral problems. They didn't eat, so they can't pay attention. They're emotionally disordered. They can't sit in the classroom. They're not going to do well in school. They'll probably drop out. The dropout rates are going to be really high. And then what happens? They're going to be poor. So the cycle is perpetuated. And, our premise in the piece is that the solution to poverty, maybe we can't as a community make them not be poor, because that's just money, but maybe we could make it so poverty doesn't have as much of a traumatic impact. And we can do that through our behaviors and our understanding of the behaviors.
Thank you, Tricia. And I know one other way that particularly our pharmaceutical companies like to address trauma in children is to prescribe pills. So I'm really interested kind of to tie it together here with Ananda's film, Magic Pills. And you're exploring homeopathy as a potential solution for mental health and other health issues, and versus pharmaceuticals. And what does your film uncover about that relation?
So the film actually doesn't look at mental health and doesn't really go in depth into the issue of trauma, but it does touch on trauma in different ways. One of the topics we explore is in Tanzania, a very large amount of AIDS widows, and how homeopathy is supporting them. But these women, their husbands die at a young age. It becomes obvious to the community that they had AIDS. And then the woman is accused of bringing AIDS to the family, which is usually actually the opposite of what happened. She's pushed out, her furniture is taken away, her goods are taken away. She's basically forced into poverty and to support her children. And these women need to work, often working in the fields and whatever they can find. And then AIDS starts to affect them quite significantly. They're very ill and they don't have the resources, the internal resources, the energy to actually go out and work. And often their children are also HIV positive from birth. And they have no options. So this clinic this organization called Homeopathy for Health in Africa has set up over 15 clinics in different rural communities. And there's often the only people who go out, the only medical personnel of any sort who go out to these communities. They make sure that they're not coming under the guise of AIDS treatment, so that people will come, because there's such a strong stigma that the women won't even come for care in case they get seen as getting treated for HIV/AIDS. And what's remarkable is, I think in over 90% of these cases, the women start to get significantly better. They're able to go back, get to work, help their children, and raise their children. And the problem in Tanzania, I know in the rest of Africa this is also an issue, is that there are antiretrovirals available, but you get, in theory, 2 lines. Really, there's 1 line of drugs available. They're very hard to get. Staying on the medication is difficult. Getting to the hospital to get the medication is difficult, even if it is free. The side effects are very hard to deal with. And once eventually you go into antiretroviral failure, where that line of drugs that you were using no longer is effective. And in Tanzania, there's no other options, that's it. So what Homeopathy for Health in Africa has achieved is to allow women to stay, if they're on treatment, they can stay on it for much longer. It seems to maintain its effectiveness. Their CD4 counts shoot way up, and all the things like Kaposi sarcoma, other symptoms, their energy returns, and they live their lives again, and they really can come ahead.
Wow, so you've traveled to India, Africa, Cuba, I understand, to explore how homeopathic healing, it touches something that science really can't explain many times, right?
I don't know if it's that science can't explain it. Science is really starting to explain a lot of the questions we have around homeopathy. The problem is that there isn't the funding to do the research, because most funding comes from the pharmaceutical industry, and there's very little money to be made from homeopathic medicine. The other problem is that the research that is done is very often suppressed. There's a huge publishing bias. As soon as a study says anything about homeopathy, it doesn't even make it to the peer review level. And part of that too is that journals are dependent on pharmaceutical income for their advertising. So they don't want to publish anything that's going to threaten their existence.
Now, I understand homeopathy has touched you personally also, right? Tell us a little bit about what it's done for you.
Okay, well, when I first learned about homeopathy, I was in a course in university on witchcraft and the occult, and that's where they taught us about homeopathy. So I came away from that course quite convinced that it was a load of bollocks, to use a nice British word. And I believed in other things. I believed in energy medicine, Reiki, Chinese medicine, herbal medicine. I thought there was a lot to be offered there, but I couldn't understand how people could be so gullible as to believe that these very diluted pellets of sugar could do anything for anyone. And I was traveling in India with a good friend whose mother was a homeopath. And I got very sick one morning, and I won't give you the details, but it wasn't pleasant. And she passed me some pills, and just to appease her, I thought, sure, I'll take your placebo pills. And I got better within a matter of minutes, and I was very, very pleasantly surprised. Later on, I went to visit a homeopath, and I'd been dealing with depression as long as I can remember from my childhood. And for me, like, I didn't even go see him for depression. I went to see him for physical stuff. And really, for me, within a month of starting treatment, this darkness kind of lifted. And it's never returned. And I was 19, I was 23 at the time. So it's been I'm very grateful for that.
Thank you for sharing that. So Rachel, let's go back to this issue of domestic violence and the battle for custody that you explored. What would you say moves you most about this issue, or gets you the most boiling about this issue? And how did you stumble upon this woman who inspired the film?
I was an editor. I am an editor, and I was asked to do just a promo for a shelter consultancy, and it was in America. And this old lady Charlotte was in it, talking about her experiences. And I thought, oh, that sounds amazing. I can make a short film about this. It'd be amazing. She's an incredibly powerful person. And I went over to Oklahoma and met her, and then she introduced me to the local shelter, and there was a woman who was staying there called Misty, who was 8 months pregnant, and we just clicked, and she's just a fantastic woman. I really got on with her, and she was in the shelter and she was going to give birth, and she said, oh, if you are here when the baby comes, will you film it for me, just as a favour? And I was like, yes, I'd love to. And so I was due to leave, she calls me and she's in hospital, so I rush over to Tulsa and I film the birth, and it's amazing, and it was so exciting. And then I nip back and I do a bit of filming here and there, and I drop in on the day before I was going to leave on the aeroplane, and the woman at the shelter said, "Oh, just to tell you, we went to pick up Misty and they removed the baby at the hospital. They took the baby away, DSS." And I had a physical reaction. I went into the bathroom and I puked because I was so, I couldn't believe it. I couldn't understand. She was coming into a shelter where she was cared for and the baby was all set up. It was amazing. And I was just disgusted, morally outraged. And that was the sort of trigger moment for me where I was like, I have to do as much as I can possible to sort of show why this has happened and also figure out how this happens. So that was the sort of beginning bit of it. And then, I kept meeting various different women across the country who had these insane stories. And Charlotte, the old lady, who's 90 next month actually, she's the sort of linchpin through all of it, because she is an example of someone who decided to stay for the whole time. She had a son, and she thought when he was younger, she thought she was staying to protect him. She'd be there, she could take the beatings and protect him. And then as he got older, they had financial commitments to him, and she was protecting him and his house and his wife and his children by staying with the father because he'd lend them money, and it was just this insane. Anyway, she's the linchpin of the whole film, and she stayed for most of the time. And then the other ladies that I meet, these incredible survivors, they just inspire me to try and figure out why and how these wonderful people that are trying to just protect children are just being shit all over. Sorry to say that, but it's true. But the children are the most amazing thing within this, because the children, they're just born into their circumstance and they are not listened to. They do not have a voice. You do not have a voice in court as a child. And that when you hear them speak, they're the most powerful voices within this whole realm. And you're just, there's a few surviving children in the film, and they're so powerful when you hear them. They're inspiring.
Interesting. I hadn't really, heard about this until I started looking into your film. So thank you. What I had heard is that rapists have been known to be able to seek custody and win visitation or custody in some cases. Have you seen that come up in?
I haven't seen that in the people that I've met.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that's a whole other film,
Yeah.
and it should be made. But the problem with films like this, films like that, and my film is people don't want to see it. It's not something that it's easier to just turn away. And I thought, making my film, I just thought, if I can focus on the children, because it was the domestic violence that was upsetting me, and the domestic violence that was like, how do you change something that nobody wants to know about? How do you make people look at it? And I thought, well, people like animals and they like children. So, if we go via the children, as I'm sure in your film, it must be similar, people want to understand why children are being oppressed and victimized. And so that was my sort of guide for making the film.
How do you think the courts can view this as justice, and where do you think the corruption stems from?
That's a big question.
Is it? I understand, just from speaking from some of the audience earlier, that this is like just scratching the surface of the corruption that's
I've got a
that's
very
taking place.
chock-a-full 82-minute film, and it still doesn't answer the question. I think if you just kind of go back and squint, it's probably misogyny, I guess, is the top problem. And financial concerns is the next one, I suppose. If you've got the money, I mean, a judge can only make a decision on what they see in front of them. And if someone is able to provide more evidence, able to provide experts, and it's a huge and incredibly complex problem, and I've literally scratched the surface.
Right. I think financial abuse comes into play too. That's a big part of domestic violence that, doesn't really get talked about a lot, but abusers can gain and maintain a lot of control over a victim just through finances. And so I imagine if they're going out to seek protective orders or, engaging in court battles, that money becomes a big issue, right? So how have you seen this come up in your experience with working with children and mothers? Have you come across a lot of domestic violence as well?
And we certainly see quite a bit of domestic violence and child abuse. We don't, I don't see, and certainly there are cases where they're involved with the court system where it gets very complicated. We see our roles as advocates for the kids. So, I've testified in court numerous times on behalf of the kids, not on behalf of a parent, but on behalf of what I see in their relationships, what I see, because, as the therapist. So we do certainly get, I would say, pulled into court for those cases. More often when they come to us, it's a single parent. So we don't actually see too often where they're battling over custody. In most of the cases we see, we would be happy if, it's usually single moms that we see, we would be happy if we could get both parents involved.
So just to shift gears a little, and this may be a sensitive question because I know in your practice or even in your film you deal a lot with children. So, but I'm curious, what's your take on the responsibility of a victim in their healing and transformation? What responsibility do you think victims have in going from trauma to transformation?
I don't really like the word responsibility in that question. So if I could edit that word, to role instead. Because responsibility seems punitive in a way, and I definitely wouldn't look at it that way. When I saw clients, as I said, I don't anymore, but when I did, my specialty was children who'd been sexually abused or kidnapped. I worked very extensively right post-abduction when kids were recovered. So trauma and victimization was all I did in my clinical practice. And my take has always been that, you can't control what happened to you, and I can't change that, but you are in control of where you go from here. And I think that's really powerful. It takes time to get there if someone's been victimized for a long period of time. But that move from feeling like you're a victim to feeling like you're a survivor, and then I actually think there's a third step past that where you don't even have to identify as a survivor because it's kind of a non-issue now. It's just part of who you are. And I do think that's something that comes from within. Obviously, people need the supports around them to get there, and that's really important. And that's very much what we do. I definitely believe in the power of mental health, but the power of loving relationships. I really think it's about relationships. But I don't believe that a history of trauma has to define someone in a negative way throughout the rest of their lifetime. If I didn't believe in the capacity to heal, I wouldn't be a therapist.
Thank you. That's beautiful. So, Ananda, what would you say is the most memorable moment or takeaway from making your film Magic Pills?
I don't know. There's so many.
Yes, you've traveled the world. It took you 7 years to make this film, I understand.
I was in the same position as you. It was self-funded, and you work when you can and when there's money, and then you take time off and devote yourself to other things when you can. Wow, I haven't been asked that, and it's hard because there's so many really significant stories, and there's many stories that don't make it into the film as well.
Is there one that sticks out to you?
No.
Well, talk to me about your time in India a little bit and what you discovered about what they're doing there with homeopathy and healing transformation for people.
So I looked at 2 stories in India, and one was how it's a third generation of homeopaths, and now it's the father and the son. The grandfather passed away, but they created incredible protocols and took a very different approach to homeopathy. Homeopathy is traditionally very individualized, so it becomes a slower process because you have to take a person's case, spend time with them. It can take about up to 2 hours, and when you have a large amount of people or you're dealing with very acute situations such as homeopaths in Haiti for dealing with trauma after the earthquake, you need to be able to see a lot of people quickly. And these homeopaths developed protocols, and it's become very controversial in the homeopathic community. Many say, oh, this isn't homeopathy, this isn't how we work, it can't work. But I went to visit the Banerjees, these doctors in Calcutta, and they see about 1,200 people success rate in treatment where Western medicine has a less than 0.1% success rate. I guess what really blew me away was that I didn't know what to expect. And they gave us complete free rein. We could go anywhere with our cameras. We could talk to anyone we wanted. We could jump into any office, any clinic. And almost everyone we met that weren't new patients had actually had a remarkable amount of success. We're talking people cured from diabetes, from all kinds of different cancers.
Wow.
It was quite phenomenal for me to see person after person having that result, and the amount of support that they have in India. And they see people for free. They don't charge people. So yeah, like that was something for me transformative, to really see the success and the possibilities with homeopathy, and that it can be used on a large scale. You can use it to see a lot of people. In Bombay, we met with this Dr. Jayesh Ballare, who's a chemical engineer. Never used homeopathy a day in his life, but he's very interested in nanomedicine and nanotechnology for medical uses. And he's got tons of technology that he's produced. And he's one of the few people in the world that has 24/7 access to his own electron microscope. So he was doing some research on Ayurvedic medicine to see if there was a nano component to it, and a friend of his suggested he look at homeopathic remedies. I don't know what you guys know about homeopathy, but it's very, very dilute, and according to the laws of chemistry, there should be nothing left of the source material in most potencies we use of homeopathy. And he was able to show over and over again source material nanoparticles in very, very high dilutions. And this work has been replicated in 12 different labs around the world. So we know now that we can't say that there's nothing in remedies, and I hope that in terms of transformation, this is going to transform the dialogue. It's going to transform the scientific basis for what we're doing. But unfortunately, this work just keeps getting suppressed, and no one hears about it. So I'm hoping to build up the dialogue from a grassroots level.
Do you see a shift here in the trend here in the U.S., homeopathy becoming more acceptable for healing?
It depends from what perspective you're looking at it. If you're looking from a patient perspective, I would say yes, and I think homeopathy is being perceived as more and more of a threat. A lot of people are tired of the allopathic route. They try it, they get sick, it doesn't always help them. We see all the corruption in the pharmaceutical industry, and people are looking for other options. And word of mouth gets around when people say, I had a lot of success with this, why don't you try it? It's growing and it's growing, and a recent study by the FDA found that now homeopathy is a billion-dollar industry in the US. But this has sparked the opposite. There's a huge, huge level of attack against homeopathy. The FDA now wants to, the FDA regulates homeopathic remedies and has been since the beginning of the FDA. They had homeopaths on board. So now they want to deregulate homeopathic medicine. They are asking for labeling on all remedies. It states that this is not scientific and there's no evidence to support its use, which is an absolute fallacy. I see stories on NPR. This is talking US, but in Canada, on the CBC, on the radio, the Minister of Health has come out to speak against homeopathy, and the attack worldwide is growing. In Europe, where it was very accepted, the royal family's physician is a homeopath and has been since the time of Queen Victoria. Now they're again wanting to take it off the national healthcare system. So the NHS is now removing homeopathy, and they had hospitals.
Wow.
They had a very integrated healthcare system there. In Australia, they've shut down all the homeopathic colleges, and the attack is just growing and growing from a systematic media and pressure, a large lobbying pressure on governments to shut it down.
Oh, thank you. Sounds really fascinating. So we have about 10 minutes left. I'd love to open it up for a few of our audience members to ask a quick question. What's up?
Yeah.
So is there anyone in the audience that has a question? Yeah, awesome. I'm happy to bring you a microphone.
I can go on hold on.
Yeah, we have some.
Good job.
This is for Ananda, and I think it includes everyone now. What happens to the body in trauma? What are the things that happen to the nervous system, to the mind, to the body when one is going through trauma? And maybe this can help us recognize it in other people or in ourselves. And
We talk about that in the bridge, actually, some of what trauma does to the brain. And it does, we know this, it does actually change neural pathways in the brain, and it changes how the, sort of what, I'm trying to think of proper layperson terms, but what sections of the brain, if you're constantly on a state of agitation, flight or yes, thank you. Then the executive functions of your brain actually shut down, which of course impacts school learning, job functioning, all sorts of things. A much higher risk for health disorders, hypertension. But on the other hand, the good news, even those changes that we see in the brain, they don't have to be permanent. And through interventions and relationships and healing the trauma, those things can be reversed. But it is, you can even see in brain imaging that it does actually have direct physical impact on the brain. We do touch on the sort of executive function impact in the bridge. We speak about that a fair amount, actually, how we set people who are experiencing trauma, unless we know how to recognize those symptoms, we're really setting them up to fail. Especially kids, a traumatized kid coming in, they're going to be dysregulated. They're not going to be able to sit in the classroom, and we say sit down and listen and pay attention, and they can't. So what if the teachers know that, then they can start from a different place and get the child regulated, so then they can sit down and learn and pay attention. But you need to understand what you're seeing to be able to do that.
Amanda?
From a homeopathic perspective, again, I go back to the idea of individualization, and trauma is going to affect everyone in a different way. I've had patients who, for me, in my experience, were subjected to a very tiny little bit of stress, which for them becomes an enormous trauma that completely paints their experience of life as a whole. And then I've had other patients who've undergone intense abuse from their parents, from family members, and they don't have that intense experience of the trauma in the same way or the effect of the trauma. But I also believe very strongly, because I see this over and over again, that chronic illness is very often rooted in trauma. And everybody has a different constitution, and it's going to respond in a different way. I don't know if that answers your question.
Did you want to speak to that at all? Okay. We have time for maybe one more question. One more question. Awesome. Let me come bring you a mic so we can all hear. We'll make it laser so we can get our panelists to respond.
This is for Rachel. I'm actually going to see your movie today, and I understand that it focuses on domestic violence of the women, and I'm not sure if it's also domestic violence of the children. Does it focus on the same issue that's going on with the sexual abuse of the children that is not being, that is being treated in the same way as domestic violence? Are you putting those under one category?
Yes, it does look at that. From what I understand, I spoke to a woman called Joan Meyer in Washington.
Yes.
I'm sure you know who Joan is. And I used some statistics that she's produced, and the statistics of if there's evidence in a custody case of a child that's been abused by one of the parents, whether that's hospital, doctor, police, the likelihood of the child being given custody to that abuser goes up. And if there's evidence of sexual abuse of the child, it goes up even higher. You are more likely for that child to be given custody to the father.
I am aware of those. I'm going to address here a statement that you made about money and power, and I agree with all of those. But I didn't agree with one thing you said, not because I think that you meant to misspeak, but I just think it's too horrific to even consider. One of the things that you said is that the judges can only decide. Have you take a look at my shirt here? It says stop court crimes, but the judges can only make decisions based on the facts they have. And in actuality, and this is too horrible for people to consider, like many of these issues are, the judges have all the evidence in front of them that they need, and it's being disregarded. And when you said that the number one cause is misogyny, the number one cause is misogyny. The second cause is children are not considered to have civil rights. This is the civil rights movement of our time. This is the next civil rights movement. And the third is that this is a $50 billion a year industry, and it can only be described as racketeering and sex trafficking in children.
Yeah.
So I actually am a capitalist. I actually am a libertarian. I actually believe that money can be a good thing, and you can do good things with it. But when you turn our courts into a business, that's when I'm going to stand up and say, no.
Yeah.
This is not what we do.
I have a section of the film where it talks about, people that are paid, people that make money out of this situation, people that are profiting from, basically the abusers. If they can step in, if they can become experts, and they get paid to do that. And they will drag it on, they will spend years and years if it's more profitable for them to keep that child in a non-decided custody situation, because then they just keep earning more money. And so in the way that financial, you can blame the financial profiteering, it's the same for the parent that has the money, but it's also the same for the people in the courts. It's a situation that has the money, the people who are profiting out of that situation, and there's a lot of them. It's a whole cottage industry, and it's so ingrained within the court system. I don't know how to start. I don't know where to start. All I can do is lay out And that's what I've done. All I've done in the film is lay out what I see, what I understand, how it works. I'm not blaming anyone, I'm not pointing fingers, I'm just laying it out. And I hope you can all come and see the film.
Thank you. Well, let's give our panelists a hand today, you guys. Thank you so much for joining us. And Rachel, looking forward to it. Amanda and Tricia, thank you so much. So you all enjoy the festival. We will be having a virtual reality experience down on the mezzanine level. I invite you to join. I'll be there too if you'd like to shake my hand, and I appreciate you all for coming out. Thank you so much.